Hey patrons, thank you for joining me on this other masterclass. Today I want to speak about productivity. Initially I set out to record a tutorial today about how I manage my template in FL Studio, but I kind of came to the conclusion that knowing about how to make a template only makes sense if you know why you would want to use a template. And I think that all boils down to the idea of how you spend your time, how you truly aim to be productive with things. So rather than showing something very specific, I was thinking, why don't I share with you how I think I appropriately manage my time, how I think about productivity as a concept, and how I go about making sure that I am productive in practice. So in this video, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of tricks and tips that you can use to improve your own productivity so that hopefully you won't be much of a slave of your own free time anymore when it comes to finishing music, because everybody struggles with finishing music. So how do you get there within a feasible amount of time instead of thinking it needs to take hours and hours and hours? Yeah, so I arrived at this point where I am right now, that I know how to manage my time by a lot of trial and error. When I started out, I felt like my music had to be the greatest thing ever. Each individual music I saw as a piece of art that I spent loads and loads and loads and loads of time on. And as time progressed, I noticed that I started fighting that idea a little bit because it's just not feasible to have, or at least I should say, it's very hard to have a career nowadays where you peek through the noise, like where you peek out through all the content that's being shared right now online in a way that you feel like you're relevant and that your career is doing well, while at the same time you actually have time to finish up those projects. I'm kind of envious of session musicians, for instance, people who play an instrument which can read sheet music that other composers have pre-written for them, and that can just, nail the interpretation on the spot. And there are also examples of producers going out there, meeting up with vocalists in the flesh, booking a studio session together, and then them actually making most of the bulk of a track within one session. And, coming from an area where I thought I had to spend hours and hours and hours to even make my drums before I could even write a song, which with those drums that I made, of which I didn't even know whether they were going to fit in a track. Yeah, that's, a very contrasting idea, or a very contrasting method. So I thought, what can I at least do, knowing that my music is usually so complicated, to make sure that I save time on the things where it's feasible to save time on. So let's go through some things. Initially, I want to speak about, before I show anything, I want to say something very important, and that's productivity usually comes from the speed at which you can make decisions. And whether they are good decisions or bad decisions is always something you can judge in hindsight. And sometimes it doesn't even matter whether you make a good or bad decision, because you can eventually choose to not use the product you've made. What tends to happen very often, generally. But it's important that you learn to set up an environment for yourself where it's feasible to quickly make a decision. If you can't quickly make a decision, it's either because you have too little options, which means you feel cornered in your creative endeavor, or you have too many options, which is also an option, or also a problem. And with having too many options, it kind of leads to inaction, to the idea that you think all these variants of this of fixing this single problem are viable, but because you can't make a distinction between, your options, and because you don't know how much, or because you don't realize how little of a difference it makes, you kind of, stop with what you're doing, and you think it's important to delve into all of these options very specifically, while realistically, usually, those options really don't matter. And if they do, then there's also a later moment where you can still go back into the details. So there's always a balance you need to strike. How do you create an environment where you don't have too many options, but also not too little, so that you still feel the possibility to be creative? Well, I like streamlining my environment so that usually the things which feel like bulk work are taken care of. So for me, that means setting up my environment so that I kind of know what I want to do. First, I'm going to talk about how I'm going to make a template. Or I think I'd rather just show you a template I already made. For instance, this one. I don't want to talk about it for too long because I really don't think it matters what I did specifically. I want you to think about what makes sense for you. So this is a template that I've been using lately. If you're not using FL Studio, don't think that it matters too much. You can do whatever you want, but I just want to show you what I think made sense for me at the time. Because I don't want you to make a template that's going to make sense forever. If you made a template for yourself that made sense forever, it probably means that with a lot of things you're doing right now, that you care about right now, you're going to have to do all those things over and over again. And I think it makes more sense to make a template that fits a specific project. For instance, if you're thinking of making an album, or if you're thinking of starting an alias, you can think about, what things do I care about considering this project or alias or this EP, whatever, right? So try to have a predefined idea of what it needs to sound like, and then try to act on that. For instance, I make drum and bass, as you know. So if I go to my mixer, it makes sense that I have a group for drums, a group for bass, a group for melodies, a group for sound effects. And lately, because I've been working more and more with vocalists and vocal elements in my music, I also added a channel for vocals. And I already predefined some sidechain, which I talked about in a previous video. You still have access to that, so that should be fine. If you want to know more about sidechain, go to that video. But setting all of this up makes sure that every time I go back in the DAW, I know exactly where to find the sidechain, and I don't have to start it up over and over and over. If I want to change it, I also know where I can find how to make the change, because I've labeled them appropriately and colored them appropriately to the group. Also, something else, I already made a mastering chain that makes sense for me. So I have a Fruity Notebook instance, which is a plugin with which you can leave notes in your project. I like to have that in the DAW. I set up an equalizer that's off because I sometimes just want to listen to the bass, and I do that while writing the music really often. I have a really simple instance of a limiter so that every time I render something, it's not going to clip. And I also have an Edison open, so if I need to preview sounds or if I need to playback sounds in detail or record some on the spot on the master, I know how to do that. I have my visualizer set up exactly how I want them, so that each time I go back into the music, I monitor my sound exactly the same and I get used to what everything looks like. I actually train my eyes just as much as I train my ears. Yeah, I could go in depth about why I made these choices, but what really matters for you is what you care about when making your music. I, for instance, care a lot about making a hierarchy in specific sounds, and I care a lot about using very specific samples in my music right now. Because I realized, for instance, that I don't like wasting time on making drums. I like making drums. I spend lots of time on it, but I do that in separate sessions. When I'm making music, I don't like to think about the details of drums. I want to write the arrangement from start to finish. So, for instance, I have a simple drum loop already predefined in the track. And this is just what a normal drum and bass beat sounds like to me. The sounds, they are really simple and they don't represent a lot, but I've already pre-mixed them in such a way that I know I'm not going to get annoyed by them while I'm writing the music. I can always figure out whether I want to work with these drums later if I think in the mix they don't make sense or if they're not peeking through correctly. And even if these are not the drums that I want to use, I've already made some sounds set up in this in the channel rack which sound very similar, and I've noticed that I go for a certain kick sound, for instance, most of the time, and I go for a certain clap or a certain snare. Well, why not already have those sounds in a template? And stuff like that makes it much easier and faster to make a decision, because I would never have to look for those sounds again. While we're on the topic of looking for sounds anyways, I think it's also important how you manage samples. I come from the idea that it's normal to have separate sessions where you make sounds and separate sessions where you make music. I know this is not normal for everybody. Some people got used to the idea of synthesizing sounds on the spot and they become really fast at it. But you can also, download loads of sample packs and sift through those as you make music and find the right thing. But often I found that it's really troublesome, because if you're like me, then spend loads and loads and loads of time on making music and making sounds separately. It feels like gravitating towards making sounds very often is very easy. Even if this is not for you, hear me out for a second. I think that making sounds separately makes sense, but only up until a certain point. I think when you're experimenting with a technique or an idea, it makes sense. But having way too many sounds in a library is usually only gonna impact your decision making in a negative way, because it is really easy to go through a really long list, in my opinion, of bass sounds, of which you don't really know, for instance, what is going to influence the track in what kind of way. I usually think it makes more sense to have a very specific sound that is kind of a basic building block as a sound stored in a place where you know where to find it every time. And then when you want to make a sound with that sound, so by creatively resampling or simply putting it in a sampler and playing it at different notes or looping it or something, you get to a point where you have control, but you also really quickly have a really unique sound. Because if you try to synthesize something in a moment, maybe when there is a fellow musician with you with which you try to collaborate, it starts getting boring really quickly. So I think it's important to have a place where you know how to find samples because of a certain structure. For myself, I have a folder which is full of secret stuff, so I won't be able to show it to you, sadly, but I have a library, and I'll open it for myself on the side. And it says, for instance, if I open the library, it says I have a folder with projects where I make music, and in that folder, I just dump everything that has to do with making music. I don't get too fussy about it because I name everything appropriately, right? But I also have a separate folder for drums, a separate folder for bass, a separate folder for synths, a separate folder for sound effects, and a separate folder for vocals. And the only samples that I put in there are the samples that I make in other sessions. And then I think they're nice. So at a later stage, I kind of go back into my experimentation folder and think, oh, that sounds great. that's actually at a point where I could make it into a song really easily. Then I drag it into the folder. So in hindsight, not in the session itself, but later, I decide, okay, this is actually something that I would want to use in my music. Otherwise, it gets really hard to steer your sound, right? And the same goes for all the other sounds. I've now just been exclusively talking about sounds that I've made myself, but what if you want to do the same for sample packs, right? It makes a lot of sense. Otherwise, you download gigabytes and gigabytes and gigabytes of sample packs. But if you already sift through a sample pack once, why do it again? If you come to the conclusion that a certain sound is nice, why not drag them into a sample pack choices folder? Or you label the samples. I think in Bitwig and Ableton, something like that is possible. Because then at least you'll know, like, hey, I know this kick is going to work. I might not want to use it right now, but I know it works. And having a collection of stuff that you know is going to work is much more valuable than having loads of sample packs through which you'd have to sift looking for very specific things. You could make a folder called sample pack choices or sample pack picks. And then you could make folders in that which say kicks, snares, hi-hat loops, very specific things, right? Folders with very specific things, because the point is not to make very generalized folders with a whole bunch of random stuff in it. No, you want to be able to go to those samples as quickly as possible, because when you're making music and you're thinking of this very specific thing, like, oh, right now I need a riser. You don't want to sift through 1,000 sample packs that have risers in them hidden somewhere, or use search functions being dependent on the fact that they are named appropriately. No, you want to be able to make sure that if you look for risers, you know where to find your folder with the risers that you like. And that makes something productive and fast. Even though it might feel like you're limiting yourself, you've already defined for yourself that you think you like stuff. And at the very least, even if you find out at the end that it wasn't worthwhile saving that specific sample, you can delete it again. You can refresh the sample library after a couple months. Or you can decide, I just want a new scenery after a while. I just need some new samples. I want to go for a different vibe. I want to change up the project. Well, then change up the template. But don't think too much about it. You can't really make mistakes here. It's just you're trying to make different stages of judgment rather than just making a single one. So that's better than nothing, I'd say. It's really just about the notes you don't play, the noise you kind of cut out, the things that you don't want to pay attention to or don't want to be distracted by. That's what I think is important to say here. Yeah. Also, I think it's also important to kind of realize what happens when you download a whole lot of plugins. I've noticed in the past that when I sat down and was on a journey to discover all kinds of plugins, I felt as if it was necessary to try all of these different tools that I saw all the time. People were talking about the newest thing on the blog, like, oh, we found this new plugin, it's called Serum, it has all of these great features, blah, 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 blah. Well, to some degree, it is worth it to pursue those kind of rumors or to tap into that feeling of curiosity to see whether a tool is really worth it. But also realize that it is very worthwhile to look at a tool which you already have and to learn it in detail. For instance, if I press F8, wait, I should have it on this screen, of course. There we go. If I press F8, you can see that all the things of which I have pictures of, these are tools with which I decided, yeah, it's worthwhile to pursue, to learn these tools more in depth, because they are really teaching me something that I don't know yet, something that is great, and something that I want to have in my music, 100%. It's also something that usually another plugin can't do better or faster, right? For instance, I have a bunch of kilohertz plugins in here, but even though I have the entire bundle, I only tend to use these 4. And there is, for instance, a kilohertz frequency shifter, but I never use it because the Melda frequency shifter is just straight up better. So I don't want to see those. I don't want to clutter my vision with things I don't want to use. And if you're still discovering what the capabilities of tools really are, then I can understand it makes sense for you to, have a workspace that is a bit more full. But less is more. Don't make yourself be distracted by things you don't need. Also, if you eventually find something about a plugin that you like, consider making a preset library for yourself of that specific plugin, right? For instance, if I've had to think really quickly, yeah, this is an interesting notion. So say that for this open hi-hat, right? It just makes a single sound. Yeah. I made sure that I already have some open hi-hats open there so that when I want to listen to something like that, I can listen to it. Just gonna open a patcher so you can see what I'm doing. And I'm gonna open an LFO tool because with LFO tool, I often do things which, for instance, I would usually do with automation, but it is so simple that something like LFO tool could easily do it way faster than that I'd have to manually draw an automation clip over and over and then have to copy it out through the playlist, right? For instance, you can automate volume over time because right now it is set to respond to a specific grid. Then by adjusting the rate, you can say, well, okay, I want the sound to, go from 0 decibels, to minus infinite decibels to 0 decibels. And at the very end, I want it to shut off again and then do the same thing over and over. Automating something simple like that makes for a very fast workflow because it's going to do it automatically for you. But it might make sense to you to save things like these. So I, for instance, have, it says 16th note flutter. But what I meant to say is 16th note flutter, which means that if I want to create a fluttering feeling that flutters once every 16th note, it's apparently something I do really often to create dynamics in a sound, then I can just slap it on a sound and I have it right there. And even if I want to adjust that sound, I could do it really quickly because the plugin allows for it. There we go, it's a quarter note flutter. So knowing where you can find your things and also not saving too many things that you might not really use again is going to make that, it's going to learn your brain to get used to a certain kind of muscle memory to arrive at a solution much faster than having to do things manually over and over again. I usually like to save things which are more of a utility kind of feature or something that makes sense as a method more than something creative, because doing something creative over and over and over and over again can get really stale really quickly, but using the same processing technique might not have the same result. It might not tire you because it's just a utilitarian, because it's of utilitarian nature. What more can I say? Yeah. Interesting. I wrote down a couple things on the side here so I don't really get sidetracked. But I forgot to speak about having samples be pre-cut. This is something more specific, so I didn't think of it just now. But when you have samples, you have the availability, you have the possibility to leave markers as metadata in the files. So for instance, I at some point made a drum break and it sounds like this. Right? it's a very simple drum break, and it sounds like something that, you know, I kind of predefined for myself. I want to use this drum sound more often because I spend a lot of time tweaking it and reusing a drum break that is at a very slow tempo allows for the option to speed it up to a much higher tempo, and then you can repitch it and do some crazy stuff to make it sound really cool. But you have a lot of options there, which is why you can always be creative in a different way with the same method. What I did to make things easier on myself is I made sure that it already has predefined cuts in the right places. So I spent some time using Edison to have these markers in the software already. To be honest, I don't know how to save predefined markers in DAWs different than FL Studio, but I'm pretty sure that it's possible in other DAWs as well. If not, don't fret, because I'm sure there are different ways of going about it, what I'm about to show you. But imagine, right, that I'd want to work on drums, and I decided, hey, I'm going to open up a patch. I'm going to use SliceX, which is my drum slicer of choice, or my sample cutter of choice. And then I'm going to chuck in this break. What's really cool is it's already going to paste the MIDI, right? Which is related to all these cuts that I've already made. So I'm going to make a new pattern, which is going to be called drum break cut. And I'm going to paste this MIDI again. And then, as you can see, it doesn't really align with the grid because it's a different tempo than the tempo of the tempo of the DAW. But if I now align it to 4 bars, I'm going to get the same drum break at a much higher speed, but with no time stretching or pitching artifacts, because I made sure that all these transients are aligned with the start of this drum break. So when I really put a lot of effort in this drum break, like the most of the time went into making it sound good, but then at the very end, I made sure that I saved it all in such a way that I can quickly access individual sounds. And if I now play this, I'm going to get something that is much quicker. And if I want to pitch it all up, it's going to stick to the same speed. And I can decide for myself how much I then time stretch it from there on. But I at least can arrive at a point where I make a specific composition with this break really quickly. I can also say, well, I'm not going to need this part of the break. So I'm going to take my time and actually, you know, just going to cut something that makes sense to what I think sounds good. Maybe something like this. And then I could do something like, yeah, maybe something like this would sound good. Just doing something random here, so if it sounds bad, don't judge me for it, but oh, there we go, it's not so bad. Yeah, and you arrive at very creative options very fast. You could do the same thing with, you know, loops of a specific nature that you like, melodies or chords that you've played. You can also choose to save MIDI data of chords you've already written at some point. There are so many more options. I think in other DAWs, it's also very normal that you can, if you've made a project, you can look like you can open up the project in a folder type format without having to actually load up and boot up the project. And then you can drag in individual tracks from a project you've already made into your current project in which you're working. So that also makes sure that you keep the effects on there, you keep the mixing, and you also keep the creativity, the speed at which you can make a choice that makes you be creative. So delve into that. Consider that it might make sense for you to load up a couple things. Then the very last thing I wanted to talk about is how you generally balance preparing with finishing stuff. Because I've given you so many tricks now that you can use to make your entire, working environment much smarter, much more sensible. But I also think that it makes sense for you to think about how much of that preparation makes sense. Because like I already said before in other videos and interviews and stuff like that, when I started out making music, I started out making sounds. And I thought, I first need to learn how to make sounds before I can make music. So I started making sounds and sounds and sounds and sounds and sounds and sounds and blah, 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 blah. But it made sure that I never ended up making music. It took me years before I finished and released my first song. And when this video is done and you're going to go into your environment to make sure that everything related to your workflow makes sense for you, please realize that you can't predefine everything. It doesn't make sense to make like a very complicated mixing scheme for all of the groups individually. Like, oh yeah, on the drums, I'm always going to need this amount of compression. And on the melodies, I'm always going to need some chorus because it always sounds nice and blah, blah, blah. Oh, maybe you can do that, but you also need to realize that then your template will become really stale really quickly. It's always going to force you in the same direction. And sometimes it just makes sense to start something from scratch. And all you need to do from that point on is just to make sure that you know where to find the things you need. But that is all what's important. Don't go overboard with preparing too much. It doesn't make sense for you to think that you need to make a drum break, for instance, that is perfectly mixed already. Like this one, the way that it's mixed I made it in such a way that it has character, that it has layers, that it has some depth to the sound. But I didn't try to make it sound as a fully mixed drum break because that's going to, be different on a case-by-case basis. And all those case-by-case situations, those are going to be the situations that you want to go through every single time in a unique way, because otherwise all your songs are going to sound the same. And that's also something you don't want. Music is only a science to to a specific point, right? Like it's not really even a science. There are some things that we think we can describe about music, but some things are never guaranteed. And sometimes you need to step back a little bit and think, are the methods that I've been using all this time really worthwhile? And does it still make sense in this context? So try not to predefine too much. That's also why I don't have too much, sitting in my playlist. And even if there would be something at some point that I don't like about this, then I just spend maybe 15 minutes changing it up. Then I save my template again. And then I'm still, happy for a couple months probably. And then after that, I might decide, well, hey, I might start using a different DAW to have a different environment, to inspire myself in a new way. Or I tell myself like, maybe my methods need to change. Maybe I need to start with a vocal every time I write music. And then I start with the instrumental later on. So I need to separate those sessions. So I'm going to do it differently. So yeah, I don't want to go overboard with giving you too much information or too much to think about. I think I'm going to call this tutorial or this masterclass quits here. And ideally, you now know how to balance preparing and actually focusing on being productive in the session, right there with your own thoughts, with your own predefined idea of what you wanted to make the day before, or that you have an environment with which you can collaborate with a friend, and that you don't lose too much time on wasting time on things that you do over and over and over again. I think generally that if you notice that you're doing things over, then you're not being smart about it. So, yeah. I hope you liked that masterclass. I was really excited about this idea and speaking about my thoughts on this because, like I said, it's something that I think a lot of producers neglect, and it's a pity to spend 80 hours on a tune if you also could have done the same thing in 20 if you try to reach for it a little more, or if you gradually over the years teach yourself to make habits out of being quick about things. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, if you have any remarks, if you have any thoughts, or if you have something very specific you want to say about this topic, please go to the Discord and go to the producer channel and share your thoughts there, because I always value everything you have to say, and everything related to your own take might help somebody else, because I always give a very biased perspective on how I do things, and I realize that's what you're here for, but I also realize that you as an artist would probably want to do your own thing. So yeah, go to the Discord, let's talk about this topic, have some fun with it, and I'm curious to see what you guys come up with. So please share that in the Discord. Thanks for joining me. As a patron, I want you to know that I value you. Thanks so much again for supporting this, this platform. And yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say. Thanks so much, and I'll see you again on the next video.